Hey fellow writers, it's me, Happy Girl Just Vibing here, and we're going to be talking about brainstorming, starting your story, and what kind of writer types there are. And this one's just going to be a fun, easy lesson, so yeah, let's get right on into it. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do when you're starting a story is start with your brainstorming. So you might have an idea about a character or a situation that's happening, and you want to go and kind of try to plot it out, and maybe if you don't have everything plotted out, try to brainstorm some ideas of where this plot can go, the direction of your story, and what kind of direction you want to take. You can go to the worst case scenario, like, you know, when your brain is like, oh, if I fail this math test, then I'll get a bad grade, and then if I get a bad grade, then I'll get a bad GPA, and then if I get a bad GPA, then I'll never get into a good college, and then I'll never find a job, and then I'll die. Worst case scenario, right? You could also create a cause and effect chart where you're like, okay, if this thing happens, then it would cause this thing to happen, and just kind of go down the line like that. And cause and effect, you can be like, okay, if this one thing happens, what are all the effects that could happen potentially? You could also just write down a random bullet list of things that just come to mind, or you can even create a timeline. Be like, at this point in the story, this happens, this happens, this happens. I've done that before where I'm like, okay, this is like the past of the character. This is where the story starts. This is like as the story progresses. And then the last thing you could do is a bubble map or a web. So if you go to figment.com, that's a great resource to do this, where you start with the middle idea and then you just keep branching out and out and out. You could also do a Q&A session, like ask yourself questions or your characters questions. Kind of interview them and just kind of get the ball rolling on your brain, your idea. The second thing you need to do is ask questions for yourself, because you got to think about these questions, and some of them are a bit harsh, but they're very important. One of them is, why are you writing this? Are you writing this for fun? Are you writing this to get it out there? Are you writing to publish? Kind of what goals do you have as well? You need to give yourself some deadlines, or maybe your goal is to just share it or just have fun with it, but you need to have specific goals in mind if you're going to write a book, especially deadlines, because otherwise, you're going to have a trouble keeping yourself motivated and keeping yourself going, which leads us to our next one. How are you going to keep yourself motivated? Are you going to reward yourself every time you get a chapter? Maybe you're keeping yourself motivated by having a writing group, and you all have to have a certain amount of pages done and to exchange it by the next time you meet, and so you guys can peer review each other. The next thing you want to do is, what do your readers learn, aka what's your theme? It's the why I should care as a reader about your story. This one's hugely important. I find that this is one of the few things that when people are like, oh, I don't know where to go with my story or whatever, this is a problem. The second problem is character motivation. So it's either they're missing a theme or they're missing character motivation. And those tend to be some of the two top things that I find that people struggle with. The last one is, who's your target audience? Because whoever you're writing to, or whoever is going to be your target audience, will drastically change the tone and kind of the mood and theme of your story. So if you're writing to an older audience, your themes may be more mature, your language might be more explicit, or maybe you have more explicit scenes. Whereas if you were writing to like young adults or children, maybe it be like easier themes to swallow, or you do difficult themes in a more palatable way. And then obviously you're not going to have a lot of swearing or explicit scenes in there. And then the last thing is, what kind of point of view or narration style are you going to use? So you got to think, am I going to write first person, second person, or a third person? And also, is my narrator going to be a character, or is my narrator going to be like a third omniscient narrator being with a personality? Or just think about how you're going to present your story to your audience and what kind of style you're going to use. Also, you want to think about your story as you're writing it. So how are the characters going to interact with the environment? What kind of setting is going to create conflict? If a character is walking through fields of flowers and they're allergic to pollen, maybe that causes some conflict. Are the characters going to interact with the environment respectfully, or maybe they're going to be conquistadors cutting things down and killing the natives? Just kind of think about what kind of characters are interacting with the environment and how are they interacting? Are they being respectful? Are they being violent? Are they afraid of the environment? Is the environment coming alive? Like if they're like man-eating plants trying to attack the characters. So what kind of settings are going to create conflict? If you have a character who's afraid of the dark, maybe stick them in a dark cave. Maybe have the cave collapse in on them and kind of create that conflict. Use your environment to your advantage. The second thing about is keeping things consistent. If you're going to have a magic system or a sci-fi system or any kind of system or just settings, you need to keep them consistent. You can't just have, unless you're having a very soft magic system where you're like, it works because magic, you're going to want to keep things distinct. You're going to want to have rules in place and you want to keep those rules there, because if you break the rules, then your magic system kind of falls apart and makes it unbelievable. Think about what does your main character want, what will get in their way. Like I said earlier, this is one of the biggest things that I find people get stuck on when they're like, I don't know where to go with my story, is they don't have a motivation for the character. They're just like, oh, this character got pulled into this thing. Well, why are they staying there? What's keeping them from being like, screw this, I want to go home and sleep in my bed? Like, what does the character get out of this? What are they doing? Are they trying to rescue their family? Are they doing it for power or for fame or fortune? Think about that. Then what kind of relationships do different characters have with each other and with their reader? A character that relates to the reader is going to make the reader feel great. You don't even have to have the main character be likable to the reader. Maybe the reader hates the main character because they're a major D-bag and they prefer to hang out with a side character. Maybe you have multiple point of views with like multiple characters telling the story and they kind of flip back and forth, and one character has more powerful relationship than the others. So think about that. Think about how that's going to affect your story, and then also think about what kind of flaws and again, motivation. Give them to your character. It makes your character human, especially. Okay, and I'll talk about more about characters in another video. The next thing you're going to want to think about is the plot. If you have any scenes in your head or any character ideas or traits or like a magic system rule or whatever, write down whatever you have. Whatever you have in your head about the story, write it down, because eventually over time you're going to get new ideas and new inspirations and stuff. So if you don't write those down, those ideas are going to disappear and you'll never see them again. Then you can start to think about where you want it to start, where you want it to end. Maybe putting in plot lines that you're like, oh, I want this to happen somewhere in the story, but I don't know where in the story. And then you want to think about how I'm going to skip from start to end, and how am I going to complicate it along the way. Like if I'm going to go from point A to point B, you know, maybe I go instead of in a straight line. Okay, so make as many complications as you can, because complications are why you're reading it. It's why you keep turning the page. It's what makes reading fun. If you have a story that's the princess met the prince and they lived happily ever after and rode off into the sunset, you're like, okay, well that wasn't very fun. But if you have the prince trying to kidnap the princess, or the dragon ends up being a prince or something, like, I don't know, you know, just think about normal fairy tales or stories and think about what made you want to read that or continue reading it and why you liked it. Then you can think about what kind of conflicts there are. Again, this is another massive thing that I will be talking about in another video, but for now you can think about if there's an internal or an external conflict. Is it in their mind, or is it happening around them? Is it man versus man, or man versus many men, or are they fighting nature, or maybe they're fighting a beast? Think about those things. And then what happens during the climax, because if you have your ending in mind, you should also have your climax in mind. And if you have your climax in mind, then you'll be able to essentially sprinkle little details and foreshadow throughout your entire story about your climax. So maybe your climax is a giant fire, and here and there you have images of fire. So when that climax happens, it's more impactful because you've already put it in the mind of your reader. And then also chapter summaries, timeline, do whatever helps you think about the plot. Brainstorm and go different directions and just enjoy yourself. Your plot doesn't have to go one specific way right away. And maybe while you're writing, you change it, and that's okay. So the basic elements of plot are, if you've ever heard of Fragment's pyramid, I don't know if I said that right, but you have your exposition, your rising action, your climax, your falling action, a resolution. This doesn't have to happen in this way. In fact, some stories have this nice little structure, but a lot of stories don't. A lot of stories have these kind of plot lines. So you have your leaf plot line where it branches out in very different ways. That's the one at the top. That looks like a leaf. And then, but they all kind of come together in the end. You have your roller coaster plot line, which is a lot like Fragment's pyramid, but it keeps getting higher and higher and higher as you go. You have your circle one where it starts where it ends. If you've ever read The Outsiders, that's exactly how this happened. You have everything as a plot point where something happens and it comes back to the main plot, and it happens to the main plot, and that's where you get that cool little Mandela's kind of flowery pattern. Then you have your braided story where there's two different plot lines weaving in and out of the timeline and then ultimately coming together. You don't even have to have two. It's two or more that are separate points of view. You have your linear storyline that kind of follows the main plot line, and then there's like subplots and a bunch of stuff happening. Then you have your endlessly expanding universe. This one I like to compare to Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn because it just keeps going. It's a gift that keeps giving. His Mistborn series, his Way of King series, his Alloy of Law series, everything just kind of is an expansively growing universe. Then you have your infinitely repeating pattern that just keeps going within several plot lines, then ultimately comes together. And lastly, you have your hero's journey, which is very similar to Fragment's pyramid. It's one of the traditional ones where, you know, let's take Bilbo. He gets called by Gandalf to go on an adventure. He crosses the threshold with the trolls, and he's like, okay, now there's no going back. And, you know, it just kind of keeps going. Another type of plotline is the rags to riches one. There's a great YouTube video out there about the guy who started these ones, basically they're your Cinderella stories, or maybe the opposite of Cinderella stories where it rises and it falls. And so if you want to take a pause and look at those graphs, please feel free. I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I think they're very self-explanatory. If you have any questions about the last slide, feel free to tell me in the comments, but now we're going to be talking about types of writers. There are different ways to approach a story, different tactics that people use to write, and you can be more than one combination of a writer. So, yeah, let's get right on into it. So I'm going to talk about what's plotting versus pantsing. So plotting is when you plan your book out before you start writing it. Everybody should be a little bit of a plotter where they have the end in mind and something like a theme or something about their story that they know that's they're going to start. And then they just write. Plotters tend to be the person who's like, okay, I got a world build, I got a character build, I got to have a big plot line going on, I got to have a summary of every chapter. They tend to be the people who sit down, plot the story, and then write it. Pantsers are like, yeah, I have a general idea. I know where that's going to go. Let's see where it takes me. And they just sit down and write by the seat of their pants. These are all things that I have made up myself to explain different types of writing and that I've discovered just based on my experience. So you have your basic pantser. They have an idea about the character, setting, or plot, and they just kind of write it out in a frenzy. Maybe they will plot some, maybe they won't. And honestly, the basic pantser who's writing by the seat of their pants just writes and almost as if they're possessed by the character and the character is taking over telling the story. A lot of times their plot, the twist, will also throw them off guard when they initially read it because they're like, I did not know my character had an evil twin brother, but here he is. He just showed up. Once you have a first draft, they don't really worry about their first draft because they can always go back and rediscover and rearrange this story in their second draft. It kind of is very, I don't know, freeing to be this kind of writer, and it's very hard. You have to be in the zone, I feel like. This one is the backwards plan. This is the backwards pantser. These people know how their story will end, so they will write the ending first, and then they go backwards from there. So they'll basically write the endings. They're like, okay, this is going to be my last chapter. Okay, how did they get there? And they'll write from point, like the last point, and then kind of go back over and kind of revisit. Okay, if they fighting the big baddie, how did they get to the big baddie's castle? Okay, they had to fight the minions. So if they had to fight the minions before that, they had to break into the castle. Like, and they'll work backwards from the climax. This is the jumper. The jumper just has a bunch of plot ideas down, and they'll just jump to that plot idea if it becomes convenient for them. If not, they will find a way, and they'll jump around the story all the time. So they might have 6 different chapters. They'll might have chapter 1, 2, and then they'll have chapter 30, and they'll have chapter 15, and like they'll just jump around to wherever they feel like, and then connect the dots from there. This is the chapter plotter. They plot the whole story chapter by chapter. So they'll usually have chapter 1, 2, and so on. And they'll be like, okay, chapter 1, I'm going to introduce this character and this is going to happen. And chapter 2, this is where the character is going to go and this is what the character is going to do. And they'll go by that. And timelines tend to be helpful for these kinds of writers, and so do character profiles. They have a big idea, and they just kind of break that big idea down into more palatable pieces. The backwards plotter, and I believe I already did this. Apparently I have 2 slides of this, but the backwards plotter is a lot like the backwards pantser, but they just plot it out instead of writing by the seat of their pants. You have your builder. The builders, oh my goodness, they insist that in order to write the story, they need to understand something almost completely, whether that be characters, plot, research, world building, or their magic system, or their science system, whatever. They refuse to write the story until they have fully developed whatever they are obsessing over and figuring out for the story. This is a very dangerous way, because you're never going to fully you're never going to fully understand your own story, because there's always more you're going to want to add to it. So if you're a builder, you need to be careful to try and limit yourself and just actually write, and instead of just continually building, because this is what this kind of writer does. You have your brainstormer. They do a bunch of what ifs. So they're like, okay, what if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened instead? And they kind of do the web idea where they have one idea and it branches out into a million different ways. This is a great idea for starting your story, but if you keep saying what if, what if, what if, what if, and you don't know which direction to take your story, then it becomes a problem. So just be aware of that if you're kind of a brainstormer. Researchers, get off Pinterest and TikTok, okay? These are the ones that are on Pinterest, TikToks, or hey, maybe you're watching this because you're a researcher and you're on YouTube, okay? They will research everything they can to write their story realistically. This is great, especially if you're writing historical fiction, or if you don't know much about a certain subject and you want to write it accurately. This is awesome. Don't get stuck on the research. Okay, it will slow down your writing. Don't get stuck on Pinterest or the internet. That's the danger of this kind of writer. Next up is the juggler. I'm a juggler, so I know this one really well. So you have lots of stories that you're writing at once. And they'll kind of juggle around with these stories. So if they're like, okay, I'm writing 3 stories right now. If I'm feeling magic, I'll write magic. If I'm feeling romance, I'll write the romance. If I'm feeling comedy, I'll write my funny relief one. So they will juggle at least, usually it tends to be 3, I find, or more at the same time. If you're a juggler, max it out to 5 main books, because if you get any more than that, you're just going to end up being a stockpiler where you just kind of hoard book ideas and you start 2 or 3 chapters, and then you go to the next one and you start 2 or 3 chapters. And then at that point, you're not juggling your books. You're building your idea profile, like you're just building a file. if you are a juggler, something that can help you feel more sense of accomplishment because you're working on multiple things, write some fiction or poetry or some short novelette, something that's under 50 pages or under 500 words. Or so that way you can at least finish something and feel accomplished, and write down new ideas and then put it in your idea bin and come back to it later. Just focus on the 3 to 5 books that you are working on right now. Okay. Oh no. A jack of all trades writes in every kind of genre imaginable just to try them out. They will continue the ones they like the most. They tend to be jugglers and do a little bit of everything. Sometimes they plot, sometimes they don't. And because these people are, their minds everywhere, they'll write down things so they don't forget them. And they like to try things out like, oh, I'll write a little bit of horror, a little bit of romance, a little bit of comedy, and they'll just pick a bunch of different genres and write them all up and mash them up sometimes. These are really fun to be, but also really difficult because your mind's going faster than your hands can type. The vault. Don't be a vault, okay? I'm going to tell you right now. If you have all your ideas locked up into your head until you get them written down on paper, great for you. You almost never forget anything. The entire novel is in your head, fleshed out. But if you're a vault, you're not really putting it down on paper usually, and it's really difficult for you to put on paper because no matter what you do, the image in your head never matches what you have out. So you got to be careful if you're a vault and you have everything in your head. Write it down. Please write it down. I know you don't think you're going to forget it, but you probably will forget it at some point. Also, it's never going to be perfect. Like I said earlier, artists, writers, people who do anything never think that they're perfect. They always think they could do better. So just feel comfortable with being a mistake and getting stuff out. The idea maniac. Okay, there's 2 types. Type 1 has a bunch of ideas. They write them down, they move on with their life, and they continue writing one book until moving on to their next idea. Type 2 writes a bunch of ideas and they try to continue them all until they get bored of an idea, or if it gets replaced with a new idea, and they never seem to finish books because they continually add new ones. So you got to be careful if you're an idea maniac. Try to be type 1 instead of type 2. You want to write it down and move on with your life. Type 2, they get stuck on that. They write it down, they get burst of inspiration, write 5 chapters, get a new idea, write 5 chapters, get a new idea, write 5 chapters, and then they never end up finishing things. Detail lover. This one's dangerous too because they love having detail in the story, but you gotta learn to trust your reader if you're a detail lover. Your writing is very rich, it's full of details, some are small, and it feels like it completes the story. I love these kinds of writers, but also you have to learn to balance. You don't want to overstimulate your reader with details, but you don't want to like understimulate them. So just find a good balance that works for you if you're this kind of person. Okay. I know a lot of you are 3 a.m. writing owls where you get burst of inspiration in the middle of the night and then you stay up writing till 3 a.m. because that's when you feel most creative and inspired. Maybe you have very vivid dreams and you write down, and sometimes they make sense, sometimes they don't. If you're a 3 a.m. writing owl like me, get some sleep. Okay, you're doing great, but get some sleep. The visual plotter is someone who plots things out visually. They sometimes have an entire wall. They have lots of profiles, world building, timelines, chapter summaries. They know their story inside and out, and they feel easier if they can see everything visually. And they always have to color code things. So maybe the red is plot points, maybe the green is the setting, and maybe the blue is the magic rules, and maybe the yellow is the characters, and this character's this color, this character is this color. Okay, you have everything visualized and plotted out. Again, Figment is a great tool if you're this type of writer. The other thing you can do is note cards, 3x5s, or sticky notes, and have a big wall or poster to put these things on. Okay, We are almost done. These are the collaborators. They write with more than one person and they build their story together. So they may collaborate together and they'll be like, okay, I wrote this part, what do you think? And then they kind of go back and like, oh, I think you should change this part. And they kind of go back and forth with each other, or maybe one person writes one chapter, one person writes the other chapter. Or maybe they go back and forth and like, okay, my character says this dialogue, what does your character say? And they'll plot things out together. Or maybe they don't plot things out together. Maybe they're role-playing with each other. They're like, okay, my character says this, and then your character responds, and it's more like a pantsing, going back and forth immediately. This is best done face-to-face via or through Zoom or something. But another way to do this is if you have a Google document and you just text each other and like, hey, I responded, okay, or YT, your turn, you know? And then these make the plot twists feel really real and original because they genuinely react to them. So this is really fun. All right, last but not least, the artist. So they write based on a piece of art they did. So if they draw or wrote a character, they're going to write about that character. Or if they drew a setting or world building, or maybe they're a graphic novelist. So they have fun writing and doing all that they can to just enjoy themselves. So a lot of times that's how it ends up. And if you are an artist, kudos to you.